impact of the case outweighs the risk of the net benefit. They've conceded to arguments about why why we have the only empirical solvency for our arguments. They've conceded our first and evidence indicates that hegemony has kept us to the Cold War, but there's been gender violence and there's been no attempt to stop, and there has not been a spillover into bigger arguments. Also consider broad evidence indicates that environmental destruction is now classical, which means that everyone is going to die, including women, which precludes the ability to solve for things like gender-based violence. We're all dead, which means so risk. The case means that we win the debate. He makes arguments about how there's no offense to gender, and that the trade-off is there is the rejection of interpretation gender. Their evidence about this is not specific enough. Their evidence is only about a conflagration between gender and sexual, but we do not. The permutation solves this argument back by doing two separate decisions, i.e. recognize the difference between the sexual and the difference between gender, which means that by recognizing that solves all the internal links to the codification within law, because the Supreme Court will recognize the inadequacy of gender and therefore institute a sexual remedy. Also, there's only risk that the permutation solves back the case, but the counterplan does not, because the counterplan does not reenact the VAWA, which is essential holding the Morrison decision, which means that they do implicit interpretations that beyond permutation. That's where I am now. First argument, he says that an implicit overrule means that it solves. We'll concede the argument that implicitly overrule, that it would be an implicit overrule if it did pass the VAWA. Our evidence in the 2AC. That's what implicit overrule means. You have to overrule the directly opposite of the other decision. The decision in the Morrison case was that the VAWA was not constitutional under the Section 5 of the 14th Amendment and the Commerce Clause, and they've conceded our piece of evidence that indicates that the VAWA is for gender-based violence. That's from our evidence about 13981, which means that even if they win their arguments about their third-party evidence, which talks about how the Morrison decision dealt with sexualized violence, they do not repass the violence against women's civil rights remedy, which has to do with gender-based violence. We are the only people who are reading piece of evidence from the text of that, and not talking about the decision, but actually about the bill of the decision, which means that there's only risk that they don't pass it back. In the world where we win this argument, there's no risk that they solve our predictability advantage, because they make the Supreme Court issue a ruling that says that the Congress can pass a remedy for sexual violence, but cannot pass a remedy based on gender-based violence. There's no distinction between those two things. Our evidence indicates that in a world where the Supreme Court cannot issue predictable interpretations based on the Commerce Clause, i.e. why the hell would it be alright under the Commerce Clause to regulate sexual violence but not okay to regulate gender-based violence, that companies can not make predictions about where to invest, and that they will not be able to predict things like environmental regulations because they don't know what the hell the Supreme Court is going to use to base its decisions about whether or not to strike down regulations, which prevents them from making investments in the future, which is critical to our competitiveness and ultimately our hegemony arguments. These are all conceded internalists, which means that if we win a solvency deficit, we had a 100% risk of hegemony. In fact, he says that permutations more unpredictable. They are not unpredictable. The fact is that our permutation, there's only risk our permutations more predictable because the two decisions are consistent, i.e. in a world where the Supreme Court rules that Congress has the authority to regulate gender-based violence, they should probably also be able to regulate sexual violence, which means that there is not a conflict between those two different things, whereas in the world of the counterplan, since the counterplan does not do the plan, i.e. it's a pick, it means that it leaves the Morrison decision on the books by arguing that Congress does not have the ability to pass the VAWA, which are inherently contradicting decisions, which means that there's only risk that the businesses don't know what the hell the Supreme Court is doing because they don't understand why the VAWA can't be passed, but some other remedy based on sexual violence can't be passed. He has no warrant for this argument. The consistency argument is the difference between the counterplan and the plan. He says that it's the only justification. The VAWA is the justification, which means that in a world where they don't allow the VAWA to be passed, they don't win an argument. They say it's mutually exclusive. His evidence is terrible on this question. He has no evidence about a trade-off, but rather only evidence about how they should be two separate issues. The permutation solves this argument back because we would separate those two issues. The only risk of a net benefit that he can argue is that there is a risk that the woman will choose gender-based litigation instead of sexual litigation because that's inevitable in the status quo because those policies exist in the states. That's the last piece of evidence. But Wednesday also his arguments to answer this argument back are new and should be rejected because it's not in the Wednesday. He says this interpretation as this argument answers, but he says the courts don't think it's important. It will codify that into the law. The perm recognizes the distinction between those two things, and that's the sexuality arguments. Will cross-apply his own solvency evidence for the counterplan here about why his sexuality is bad in worlds where they win that argument, and that distinction is important. It's a reason why the permutation by creating two distinct decisions and having the United States the Supreme Court codify those decisions by passing separate decisions regulating gender-based violence and sexually-based violence means that there's only risk of the permutation solves this argument back. He says that it leads to oppression. He says all his impact arguments here. He's conceded the RU chips arguments about why it's non-unique because there's gender-based violence now. Also that the use of gender is inevitable because things like state courts will continue to use those animus standards and not sexual-based standards. He makes argument how about non-unique he's being offensive, but he's conceded the arguments about in a world where there's no hegemony, everyone would be dead, including women, which means that if we want the possibility of advancing towards a society where we recognize the inadequacy of the notion of gender, we have to do the permutation, because only in that world are we alive and can we advance all sorts of movements. He makes an ethical argument, but there, evidently, evidence only says it's important. It's not a reason as to why you would outweigh death, which is critical to all those movements. Will win that day. That death is a prerequisite to the determination of values and the determination of ethics, which means there's only risk that we would extend our lived evidence, which indicates that the methodology that gender violence spills over into greater structural violence does not meet empirical tests, which is also the argument made by our Nikaya No 3 evidence. If our evidence isn't about repression, our evidence is reasons why lower-based structural violence will not spill over into war violence. Also conceded our bunch evidence, which indicates that war empirically transgender and women are oppressed more and more, which means there's only risk of hegemony. In fact, turns back to the net benefits of permutation. He says choose litigations that benefit. That's above. He says there's no evidence that other courts use gender. That's the last piece of the 1AC evidence. Also, this whole contention of the 1AC also is a new argument, which means you should throw it out, because we went for this argument because he conceded in the 2NC. Which we talked back time. He says there's no net benefits of permutation. I don't know if you were paying attention or not, but there's only risk that we saw predictability, and it proves that counterplan is the same as permutation, because women will still have a choice in states, which is the only net benefit articulated, which means that in a world where there are both choices in the permutation of counterplan, there's no net benefit.